Hi, everybody. Welcome to Thursday's lecture. So, I wanted to focus on two aspects that we are seeing in the readings in The Color of Law and in White Fragility. And I wanted to kind of hone in on some of the material because um, there's a lot of it. and it might be overwhelming, all the different court cases and the different locations. And The Color of Law is written by someone in law and therefore has a lot of that kind of litigating language, which can sometimes just be a deluge of specific detail to the point where it might wash over you and not necessarily be something that you can glom onto. So my attempt at this lecture is twofold. One, to kind of create more of a narrative context around certain aspects of particularly Chapter 3 in The Color of Law about zoning practices that happened in the early 20th century. And then I also want to provide some coverage of D'Angelo's examination of aversive and cultural racisms, especially since both of these are related to the discussion questions. I want to make sure that you're as kind of clear in the intent as possible. So in Tuesday's lecture, I talked about the migrations. This is something that you probably know from your U.S. history. The Great Migrations of, prior to World War I, and then the Second Great Migration around World War II. We're going to talk more specifically about the time of the First Great Migration. We all know about Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws, in a nutshell, were kind of established post-immediate Reconstruction, and they were laws that were brought into primarily the South after the federal government had agreed to kind of pull their troops back, or pull the authority over the South in order for them to integrate Black folks into the society. Remember that prior to 1910, 90% of Blacks lived in the South, right? And so it was predominantly a Southern phenomenon. And the federal government had, after emancipation, after the Civil War, had kind of a governance over the South in order to make the integration as peaceful as possible. But eventually, the government started to recede the troops, started to recede the authority, the oversight over the South. And that's where we got the Jim Crow laws. And we know the Jim Crow laws were brutal. You've probably explored those to some degree, but you can always look them up. And they really were implemented in the later part of the 19th century. So, decades after emancipation. So this was a challenging moment in history because Black folks weren't as protected when the federal government had oversight in the South. They were victims of these Jim Crow laws. We see a rise in lynching. We see a rise in violence against Black families, Black bodies. And that's when we have, that first kind of push of migration where many Black folks moved from their southern, primarily rural areas to cities around the country, but mainly in the North and the West. And of course, in the South as well. Well, of course, that influx was going to disrupt life. And many people, being not as familiar with Black culture and Black bodies themselves, got nervous about their home values. Now that African Americans could buy homes by law, there was an anxiety around, will the property value of my home drop? And in fact, the truth was it would. based on these kind of systemically racist ideas prior, the ideas of inferiority that I'm sure you've explored in previous readings and classes, property values did go down. We all know that property assessment is a very relative process, right? The reason why, small apartments in San Francisco could be worth 1.5 million, and the very same thing could be worth 60,000 in Mobile, Alabama. And so there is such a relativity to the valuation of property. And because property and the ownership of property is such an American cornerstone of what it means to be successful, you can imagine that people felt threatened if the encroachment of black bodies would somehow, even though those black folks would take good care of their properties and had good jobs, that still it could indicate a valuation drop in the property, right? So there is that reality which still exists. I'd love for you all to investigate this, but it absolutely still exists. With that being said, and this idea of individualism and property ownership, which are two kind of American values, there were a lot of kind of retaliations by governments, by local governments, to forbade blacks from living in white neighborhoods. Yeah. And eventually the Supreme Court had to do something about this. And so in 1917, there was the case of Buchanan versus Worley. And essentially what this Supreme Court decision did was it voided racial residency statutes that forbade blacks from living in white neighborhoods, right? The court ruled that that these statutes violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which establishes the rights and freedoms and equity of black bodies, right? So this was a constitutional reference. However, the dollar speaks more than the law a lot of times in America, right? And white folks, whether they were being overtly racist or they just wanted to ensure that their property values would stay high, they sought loopholes in the Supreme Court case by using racially restrictive covenants in housing deeds. And then real estate businesses informally applied them to prevent the sale of houses to black Americans in white neighborhoods. Essentially, what they did was they incorporated covenants into deeds, which are private relationships, right? It's a contract between private persons, the sale of a home. And in some ways, that can be outside the scope of a constitutional amendment, right? So, for example, someone can obviously sell a home to whomever they want, and without it being something on paper, they can ensure that that occurs. And then, of course, you're just in covenants with, lending officers, banks, homeowners associations, right? You never explicitly make it something like, I do not want to sell to a black person. But because it is a contract between private people, the sale of a home, and there is personal preference made, that could potentially be outside the scope of the 14th Amendment. So this is happening all around the country. There are many cases where people were utilizing these restrictive covenants in the deeds of their homes. And then they would just defend it, saying like, this is between private people. This is not, this is not within the jurisdiction of the government, unless there was the request for the state to uphold the covenants, right? Meaning like you're incorporating the government into the private practice. Well, this loophole, as a result of the Supreme Court case, became incredibly prevalent. And we see so many instances where the loophole was employed through these restrictive covenants in the deeds of a property. And of course, they were challenged in many different places. If you look in page 46 and 47 of The Color of Law, it talks all about how there was this incredible attempt to push back against the loopholes that were developing, to summon the 1917 Buchanan versus Worley Supreme Court decision. But that is a battle that is rather challenging, especially because the people that were probably challenging it most were Black folks themselves. And we have to remember that they had only been in an economic system where they were viable and at least on paper equitable for only a few decades. It takes a long time for kind of the economic establishment of a community that had prior to that, only a generation before, had been property themselves with no ownership at all, no resources, no capital to build off of. It obviously just takes a much longer time. Those people could not challenge the ones that were established with equity, aka white folks that were trying to use the loophole. They couldn't challenge them in court because it costs money. Make sense? So you kind of have a feedback loop of agency vis-a-vis your resources. And so what we see is more segregation occurring after the Supreme Court decision that was trying to protect or prohibit segregation, but through the loopholes, of course, made it so that it was easier for different organizations, individuals, neighborhoods, associations to segregate after all. And we became more a segregated nation post-1917 until well into the 60s than we were in 1880s, as The Color of Law kind of articulates. Okay? These zoning discriminations became so prevalent that they take on an almost expected presence in a lot of cities. And zoning discrimination in a nutshell is white homeowners in many U.S. cities regarding blacks as a social and economic threat to their neighborhoods. If blacks moved into the neighborhoods, home values in that neighborhood would decrease. And so as white homeowners took great pride in their homes and often viewed them as their life's investment, like I mentioned earlier, they feared that allowing one black family to move into their neighborhood would ruin their life investments. And so, again, even if it wasn't an intentional racist act, it wound up being ultimately a utilitarian version of that anyway. To prevent their neighborhoods from becoming racially mixed, many cities kept their neighborhoods segregated with local zoning laws. And such zoning laws required non-white and white ethnic groups to reside in geographically defined areas of the town or city, preventing them from moving to areas inhabited by the other. And these zoning laws were part of these covenants that were integrated into deeds. So it maintained a private relationship. Okay. But ultimately, when you kind of zoom out from those logistics, you see most of the country involved in these restrictive covenants to protect valuation. Now, we can kind of figure out what would happen as a result. Because if there were only certain areas that black folks could buy property, and they were typically based on these covenants in less desirable areas, then their property value would never go up in the relativism of property valuation. And as a result of that, there would be less taxes, there would be less money going back into those areas, the perpetuation of a cycle of poverty, the list goes on, the list goes on, the list goes on. I think we're going to examine that more and more as we go along in the class, but it's really important to understand kind of the beginnings, the commencement of these racial zoning laws that, again, were an attempt to provide loophole to the 1917 Supreme Court decision. Okay? Now, you take that further to the idea of redlining. In 1934, the National Housing Act was signed into law by FDR, President FDR, establishing the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, which many of us use now. For example, I took out an FHA loan to buy my house in Oakland. First-time home buyer. This idea to try to catalyze more home ownership, as it somehow kind of characterized the national identity that we could own property in America. And the FHA was commissioned by the Homeowners Loan Corporation to look at 239 cities and, in this kind of initial implementation, create residential security maps to indicate the level of security for real estate investments in each surveyed city. And these maps marked neighborhoods by quality from A to D, with A being the nicest neighborhoods and D being the worst. Now, the reason for this is because the federal government is supplying the loans under this new implementation of an FHA, right? The Federal Housing Administration. And so they want to secure their investment, right? So it would, if one was to apply for an FHA loan in one of the A neighborhoods, being the nicest, it would be much easier for them to do so. And of course, D being the worst. Every neighborhood that was part of this security mapping commissioned by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, every neighborhood with some Black population was given a D rating. And the residents of those areas were refused loans. This practice is called redlining. And what it did was, on top of these covenants that had been established as loopholes with Buchanan versus Worley, it now gave whites an economic incentive to keep Blacks out of their communities. So even further we perpetuate the feedback loop of poverty, this kind of vicious cycle. It's really important to look at racial zoning as one of the initial aspects of how we are seeing the phenomenon of the Black community today. Because it was during this period, and we'll talk more about this later, where the Black community goes from beginning to ascend in economic advantage to plummeting. And we'll, of course, talk more about those aspects later in the quarter. So now let's switch gears to D'Angelo's text. And I asked you in one of the discussion questions to kind of define and then to come up with your own examples through your observations of aversive and cultural racism. So what I wanted to do was to give you an idea, the definition of each, and then to give you a story. In my experience, it's somehow related to each form of racism. Aversive racism. It's a form of contemporary racism that, in contrast to the traditional form, operates unconsciously in subtle, more indirect ways. Aversive racism aversive racists regard themselves as unprejudiced, but at the same time harbor negative feelings and beliefs about members of minority groups, simply developed through normal cognitive biases and socialization of which they are largely unaware, and which they try to dissociate from their unprejudiced self-images. Now, we already know, as D'Angelo purports, that prejudice exists in everybody, right? All around the world. It's not something that is relegated to a particularly American experience. However, discrimination is the action of that prejudice. And that, of course, becomes something that is more invasive and oppressive, right? So I have a story for aversive racism. It was a conversation with my mother. She desperately wants to leave Baltimore, and in fact, she's about to move to Alabama. And I grew up in Central City, Baltimore. She desperately wants to leave. And she said to me in a conversation, "It's getting bad." And I asked her, "What is?" And she said, "The criminal element." Well, I looked up crime in her neighborhood. It hasn't risen. What has is the number of black families moving in to my mom's neighborhood. Now, she defends upon my reporting of this. She says, "I don't care what color moves into my neighborhood. There are bad black people and there are bad white people." When I report to her the statistics, she says, "Well, they must be wrong. I know that there's more crime," right? So what we have here is an aversive racist moment where the presumption that the black body in presence somehow enhances the criminal element. And despite the fact that the statistics said otherwise, my mom still thought that there was more of a criminal element in her neighborhood. That's an example of aversive racism. Cultural racism is those aspects of society that overtly and covertly attribute value and normality to white people and whiteness itself, and devalue, stereotype, and label people of color as other, different, less than, render them invisible. So that seems kind of simple and basic, and how could we ever engage in cultural racism, since none of us are actively attempting to be discriminatory? Well, furthermore, when one group exerts the power to define cultural values for the society, cultural racism occurs. When one group exerts the power to define cultural values for the society, cultural racism occurs, right? We might privilege the kind of cultural values that our particular community have, and if the people who exert the power to define cultural values are primarily utilizing the ones from their own experience, well, wouldn't it make sense then whoever is in power has the ability to oppress those who don't? So consequences of cultural racism are that minorities are encouraged to turn their back on their own culture and to become absorbed by the majority culture. In this case, in America, that is white. Yeah? Cultural racism is furthermore communicated to and by members of all racial groups in everyday activities, and it is passed on across generations. I think we can see this not just in a white-black binary, but in all aspects, that somehow adhering to a presumably white culture, we are somehow valued more. I mean, let's think about it. When we consider regional Southern black vernacular, for example, we might immediately attribute that dialect to somehow being less intelligent than if someone was to communicate more like the way I am doing currently. Yeah? Don't we put value on certain dialects? Don't we immediately hear a Southern accent and think that maybe they're not nearly as smart? And that's just within race. Imagine now if you were also bringing in any kind of cultural vernacular. You might be able to determine value upon instance, right? A prejudice that then might coalesce into a discrimination in terms of the way that you judge that individual, maybe in the way that you evaluate them. So that's a version of cultural racism. I have a good story for this and I wanted to share with you. At a literary reading, a fairly prominent writer I had met once previously was chatting. And one person was chatting about rents versus income in San Francisco. So this isn't too long ago. Um, and when this person was chatting about rents versus income, he made a comment to me that it was sort of inappropriate to mention how much you make at your job and pay for your rent, to mention money so blatantly. So he said this, right? Then, in the very same conversation, upon discovering that my husband was brown and black, he nudged me, saying, "You must like that big dick, yeah?" Yeah. He thought he was being funny, but juxtaposed these two comments in relation to what is appropriate. Obviously, talking about black stereotype in an exoticized way, what he believed was a positive trait, is somehow within the agency of decency, more so than sharing how much you make and spend on rent. Furthermore, when I said the comment was inappropriate, he said to me, "Come on, I was just making a joke. Lighten up. You don't always have to be a social justice warrior." I replied, "I like funny. I like jokes. There's plenty of other ways to be funny." So think about this. In one moment, he criticized me for saying it was inappropriate of me to talk about chatting about income versus rent in San Francisco, talking about how much I made at my job and paying for rent. Yet, he did not think it was inappropriate to allude to my husband's penis. So, we have something here. That this guy went there and that he figured that I was being too sensitive with something that he was kind of associating with a positive trait, that he went there specifically invokes something a little bit more systemic. It's not just about him. It's something more systemic about what is considered appropriate to talk about, right? So that would be an example of cultural racism. Now, come up with your own. We all have observations of this. So make sure in the discussion question that you kind of define how you're understanding aversive and cultural racism, and then come up with a story that you think is exemplifying it in a unique way so that we can amalgamate all of these stories and we can illustrate these concepts so they're not just staying in the realm of intellect and academia, but indeed are lived experiences. All right. I hope this wasn't too painful. Have a great day and good luck with all of the work.